How important is the BBC in British public life?
What the importance of the BBC is that we all own it. It belongs to everybody, and that's why it gets criticised so much, or one of the reasons, because we all have a stake in it.
And do you think that those programmes, Day Programme, Panorama and so on, do you think they're less central in the national conversation than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago?
No, I don't think that the BBC's lost its role. If anything, it's increased, because you've seen the sale of daily newspapers has fallen off. The rival media have probably gotten weaker. And so, if anything, the BBC has become more important, not less. There's the fragmentation of other media. I don't think the rise of social media has been particularly important in that way, because it's such a sort of fragmented discourse.
We're constantly told that the BBC is increasingly subject to government scrutiny, government interference. Is that true? And if so, how new is it?
I don't think the government exactly interferes today with the BBC in the way that it used to do. But what it definitely does do is try to attack its public space and to remove its resources, as it recently did when it forced the BBC to bear many of the costs or some of the costs of the welfare programme by giving free licences to people over the age of 75. I think the BBC has always been interfered with by governments. I think if you look at its role during the general strike in 1926 as an agent of state propaganda in the World War II, in the Cold War, its readiness to accommodate the wishes of MI5 and MI6. I don't think there's anything particularly new about government interference.
So when the BBC has to internalise these costs of paying for free TV licences for over 75, that could take up to 1/5, 1/6 of its entire budget. It's a significant amount of money. When it does that, is there a very real chance the BBC will no longer be a market-making institution? It would be more like the US PBS.
In the United States, there is public service broadcasting, but it's so tiny. In Britain, it's really at the heart of our national broadcasting. It needs to be independent, therefore. It needs to be able to stand up against the government, and it also needs to be large enough to represent not the state, but represent the common consciousness of the British people in all of its various manifestations, different nationalities, different races, different ages, different classes.
Well, there's an argument that says that the Britain in which the BBC was initially conceived was far more ethnically homogenous, linguistically homogenous, culturally homogenous. Even in terms of class antagonism, it was a different world, especially when we had the grammar school system. There was at least at the surface level, a far more meritocratic element than we see in Britain today.
It's all sounds absolute balls, what you're talking about. I mean, if you go back to the 100 years ago almost, when the BBC was set up, Britain was different.
Right.
I think the regions were much more powerful. I think that the centre was much weaker. I think that the class struggle was still going on.
Yeah.
I mean, so in many ways it was much more diverse then than it is now.
Right.
There was a man called Thompson, who was the Director General, and he had a 3-day beard, and he had, and they all had these three. You have one, by the way. You've got a 3-day beard, and that's what they were all like. There was sort of
maybe I can get it with the BBC.
You know, exactly. It's a sort of knowing statement that you were of the establishment, but you weren't. You're part of this sort of metropolitan conformity, a bit radical, a bit edgy. There was this word they all had. They were all edgy, and they were totally contemptuous. Anybody who wasn't clever and London-based. And if they weren't London-based, then they had to be somehow. It was quite helpful if they were black. But if you were sort of a white working class person from Liverpool, you regarded with sort of genial contempt. And I think that what the BBC sort of forgot was that it represented everybody in Britain. and particularly it represented stupid people and white working class people and everybody.
But the Britain, the world in which it was born, there was empire, there was a far more confident sense of self in terms of the British nation state. That's gone. I mean, ethnically and linguistically, you're saying what I'm saying is gone. But it's certainly not as strong as it was in the 1930s.
What isn't as strong?
The sense of imperial confidence. It wasn't strong in the 30s. It wasn't the same as the 1890s, sure, but it was far more than it is in 2015.
I still think, though, that there is a sense of what Britain is and what we stand for and what we are. And it doesn't have to mean that we represent some sort of imperial thing,
right?
But we're we're just as multicultural,
right?
We're just as open to the world. We should be.
So there's no reason, in your thinking, then, why the BBC can't be as vibrant, as necessary as.
I hope it's not going to be vibrant. You're full of these bits of language which.
The totems
which are used by
the
BBC
Thompsonites.
executives. Yeah, which are used by BBC executives.
They do with the money, Peter.
Yeah. You've got to get out of the way. But the BBC was captured by these young, creative types, and it really needs to lose some of that.
So that's the main reason why it's failing, because it's been captured by a retinue of people.
A retinue, as I say, people like you with 3-day beards.
Well, is that it? Is that the cost of entry?
People like you with 3-day beards who were quite well educated, but rather feel a bit ashamed of the fact they're well educated.
Well, I went to a state school, Peter, but we won't go into that. My dad's a taxi driver, we won't go into that. Yeah.
And I feel that they might just feel a bit more confident about Britain.
So Michael Grade recently spoke of how, and I quote, "You wouldn't invent a hereditary monarchy today. You wouldn't invent the House of Lords. You wouldn't invent the BBC in a dynamic market. You either believe in it or you don't. You can't intellectually, in a modern sense, with a modern mindset, justify that." You obviously don't agree with that, but what do you think?
It's just gibberish. I mean, it's sort of, Michael Grade is very, very thick. I mean, how does he know whether we'd invent something or not? I mean, what's this great knowledge which Michael Grade's got, which enables him to say whether such and such a thing would be invented? Yeah?
So who was the last Director General who you had a significant amount of respect for then? We've talked about Grade, we've talked about Thompson.
I mean, I don't know the names of all the Director Generals, but I feel that you go back to Lord Reith.
Yeah.
He had a notion of what the role of the BBC. He didn't talk about dynamic markets the way that Grade apparently did in that quote, or Thompson, which has luckily gone to the United States, where Reith has a sense of what it is to be British. A much more modest vision, in a way, of what the BBC is, just that it's there to inform and entertain the British people. It didn't come up a bilge like Lord Grade does about dynamic markets, which has nothing to do with the BBC, and it's a misunderstanding of what the BBC is for. It isn't part of the dynamic market, to use Lord Grade's debased language, or the state, to use the vision of the kind of Stalinists and the socialists. It's to do with something which we all have in common.
In a piece which you recently wrote for Open Democracy, you spoke of how, and again I'm going to quote, "The BBC is one of a tiny number of institutions that holds us together as a nation. For all its faults, it is one of the jewels of our common national life. It is time for British citizens to take sides, come out and fight for the BBC, and if necessary, to man the barricades." What exactly does manning the barricades look like in defence of the BBC?
We have to see off a government which wants to slice it up. Now, there are two kinds of attack on the BBC. One is the attack which occurred under New Labour about 10, 15 years ago, when they tried to destroy, and very successfully did destroy, its sense of integrity, its sense of independence. At the same time, you've got to see off free market attacks on the BBC, which says it's got to compete with ITV and all that gradient junk which you just read out to me.
In terms of manning the barricades, what strategic? I mean, if there's a strategy to save the BBC,
you've got to come out and defend it.
In the last couple of years, though, it's fair to say, with the NHS, the whole range of institutions, everyday people feel powerless in terms of defending them or changing them for the better. I'd imagine the same is true for a lot of people with the BBC. How does the average person watching this, who enjoys the Today programme, Radio 4, how do they defend it? Because they really don't know what to do.
Well, the first thing you do is you pay your licence fee. I mean, and you say it's 150 quid or something, I get incredible value for that, and it's my way of joining into something which I have in common. Everybody in this country is available to. You don't have to pay £500 or £1,000 for it by going on to Sky. You don't have to consume loads of advertising. It's part of the deal of being British.
I'll repeat the question then, because it seems almost like it's impossible to change in the direction you're talking about, Thompson, grade, all of these.
No, there was a very bad period in the late 90s, start of this century, when you got they became very greedy. They started paying themselves huge salaries. B, they became very conformist. They grovelled to the government. And you've got to go back to a position where you realise it's an enormous privilege to work for the BBC, and you're not going to expect to get the same kind of giant salaries you get at Sky, maybe, or ITV, or Google. You know, actually, it's a bit of a privilege, like what's serving in the British Army. You know, a general in the British Army gets paid £150,000 a year. He doesn't get paid £8 million a year as a top corporate executive. But there's a huge privilege there about being an officer or, in the armed services.
Do you think that still exists, so that public service?
Of course it bloody well still exists. And if it doesn't exist, the BBC, you might as well close it down tomorrow afternoon.
Well, maybe that's the problem then, isn't it? If it doesn't exist, then that's partly explaining why the BBC's in trouble.
Well, there's a Lord Grey, right? He was appointed to a top job at the BBC and left it 2 years later. He just left because money obviously mattered too much to him, because he didn't care about this country. And I said that was what's shameful about Lord Grey. It's why he should be despised by anybody, and he's not allowed into this conversation, because after 2 years he just left to the private sector. There's something wonderful, because it isn't part of the private sector, it's not part of the state sector, it stands for what we all have in common.
Because in that same piece you did touch upon, you said the word neoliberalism critically, which is a real rarity for a journalist coming from your background.
So not really, but yeah.
Well, no, I mean, given that, for instance, it's at the moment it seems to be a word that's being castigated by everybody. So what does it mean? You know, people like Marr and Robinson. But anyway,
what it means, by the way, Marr's overpaid and so is Robinson. What it means is that the only thing which matters is a school of thought which says the only thing which matters is money. And quite frankly, money is the thing which matters least. So, we're all part of the same setup in the end of the day, trying to make it work. For me, your work characterised Burkean conservatism as something I really have a whole great deal of respect for. But it seems to me that there's very few people making a defence of the BBC, saying the kinds of things you're saying from that background. In fact, I think you're unique in saying it. I'm not seeing many conservatives or people from the right saying the things that you're saying. Am I wrong? Well, I agree with this in the sense that I think that if we are having an attack on the BBC from Whittingdale, the Culture Secretary, backed by Osborne, the Chancellor, to make it smaller, and if that attack is being made on behalf of powerful private sector interests like Murdoch, then that's terrible. And I do think that there is an element of an attack on the BBC from the current government, which is one of the reasons I said you have to man the barricades. But that comes from a misunderstanding of what conservatism is all about. There is all the difference in the world between the conservatism as a political movement, as it existed all through the 20th century, or almost all through it, and a free market.
So you said a little bit earlier before that the BBC was a uniquely British institution, that it exhibits uniquely British kind of characteristics in terms of its role in public life. What does that mean?
Being British is about being decent. It's about being, by the way, it's not, other countries are allowed to have these characteristics as well, nevertheless. But it's about being very decent, tolerant, kind. I always think supporting the underdog is something which we do. And there are a lot of institutions which embody, not that many, but the Parliament, the armed forces, the rule of law courts, the rule of law, that sense of fairness, the NHS, flawed though it is, the monarchy. I know you're allowed to be a Republican and British, by the way. They're about service. It's about being a bit unostentatious, not always succeeding, but doing your best. In the 20th century, the NHS and the BBC emerged as a new kind of British institution which hadn't existed before. And so it does represent our common consciousness, and if it ceases to do that, then it ceases to be worth bothering with. there's a very sinister move from foreign-based, often foreign, just basically foreign media tycoons who want to destroy it because they don't like Britain. We know that.
Why don't they like Britain?
Because they don't like the fact that we are a bit democratic. They want us to be a free market, a pure free market. You know, in Britain has all kinds of we do have all kinds of values beyond the free market, which are very important.